Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar today. I'm Beth Mashesky, Senior Scientific Specialist at the Illinois Sustainable Technology Center. I organize the seminars at ISTC and will be your host for today's webinar. Today's webinar is the first in the Fall 2019 series. There are 3 other webinars in the series this fall, and you can find out more information about those on our website, istc.illinois.edu/events. A few housekeeping items before we get started. We are recording today's seminar, so I'd like to remind our audience members here to silence electronic devices. We will also hold all questions until the end, at which time we'll bring around this microphone so that those online can hear your questions. For those online, you'll be muted the entire webinar, but you can type in your questions to the GoToWebinar toolbar and we'll answer those at the end as well. And with that, I'm very pleased to welcome today's speaker, Andrew Turner. Andrew is an associate professor in geochemistry, pollution, and the environment at the University of Plymouth, UK. He has over 30 years of experience in a wide range of fields. His current research interests include novel applications of XRF, fate of pharmaceuticals in aquatic systems, marine microplastics, geochemistry of technology critical elements, recycling of plastic wastes. And he is an affiliate of the advisory board for the Lead Safe Group, a member of the International Scientific Committee for Estuarine biogeochemistry, and on the editorial board for the Marine Pollution Bulletin. Thank you, Andrew, for joining us, and the webinar is yours.
Okay, thank you, and thanks for the invitation. Just to add to the background, my training has been in marine chemistry or marine pollution, so I was a marine scientist. And you may think, how have I got involved in consumer products? Well, I was looking at heavy metals in sediments, and as part of a project a few years ago, we started looking at metals in anti-fouling paint as a source of metals in the environment. And from there, we started looking at consumer paints and then consumer plastics. And the things that they have in common, which I was surprised about, is that one of the big issues is things like heavy metals and other hazardous chemicals that are in each type of material and environment. So I've changed the title slightly to emphasize some of the most recent research and in marine microplastics. So I've sort of come full circle. I started off as a marine scientist, gone through the consumer items, and now back looking at plastics in the ocean. And just to give you an indication of Plymouth, for those of you that aren't aware, it's in the southwest of the UK, and it's actually it's referred to as Britain's Ocean City. It's actually the only city in the UK which faces the Atlantic Ocean. So it has a very maritime and pleasant climate, and it's historically very important for marine research. Onto a presentation outline. I'll briefly mention the history of plastic and also marine plastic, in other words, the plastic that's lost at sea. Sources and environmental and health impacts, also a little bit of an insight into the regulations, in particular regulations on hazardous elements in plastics. And with respect largely to cadmium and lead, which are perhaps the two most toxic metals, heavy metals, certainly in plastics, I'll be talking about how they associate with plastics from the environment and what has been added deliberately during the manufacture. And finally, I'll talk about bioaccessibility. In other words, we have a handle on how much of these additives may be in plastics, but are they accessible to, say, humans or animals that consume them? So that's an outline of the talk. This slide here just shows us a historical perspective of plastics. We had plastics natural plastics going back several hundred years, but it wasn't until sort of early 1900s when we first started to see the introduction of synthetic polymers. And it was largely due to the introduction of the injection molding machine, which allowed plastics as a powder to be heated, melted, formulated or molded into a product, and then recycled, in theory, many times. And if we see in red here on this list, different types of plastics which have been developed. So Bakelite was the original one, polyethylene, polystyrene, PVC, all the way through to PET, polyethylene terephthalate, which is a mainstay for storing food, water, drinks, microwave meals. Also in blue here, some milestones. So we have the first plastic bottle, polythene here in the 1940s, first polythene bag, first plastic bottle made out of PET in the 70s, and then since then we've had mobile phones. And plastic has become by far the most used type of material back in, well, we're going back sort of 45 years or so. I'm sorry, this graphic isn't well, it did have a little cartoon on it, but yeah, nevertheless. You'll notice here that since 1973 there haven't been any significant polymers developed. So we've had this window from about 1907 to the 1970s where we've developed all sorts of plastics. The focus really amongst the competitors of the industry since the 1970s has been on using additives. So rather than get a new polymer that's stronger or more flame retardant or more colourful, the industry focus has been on additives to these existing polymers. For example, what can we add to polyethylene to make it stronger, to make it flame retardant, to make it anti-foaming, or whatever we would like to do with it. A couple of charts here. This just shows the growth in global plastic production up to 2014. And you can see here there's a line here, but it really is an exponential rise in the use. And I often refer my students to this as an example of an exponential growth curve. And if you were to continue this up to 2019, it would continue to be an exponential trend. So plastic production has been increasing exponentially, and of course it has a wide variety of uses because of its cheap cost, easy to manufacture, relatively inert, and it's waterproof, very durable as well. So all of these properties have attracted it into packaging, building and construction, medical sector, clothing, toys, agriculture, transport, electronics. So it has a wide and a diverse range of uses. And I'm sure wherever you are, whatever you're using, a device, clothes you're wearing, spectacles, pens, you know, all constructed of, or in part at least, of plastic. What about marine plastics? Well, a lot of people perhaps unaware that marine plastics were studied back in the 1960s, early 1970s, especially in New Zealand. It seems to be a place where there was a lot of plastic washing up in that era. And scientists were looking at the occurrence of it, and they started looking at accumulation by wildlife in the 1980s as well. Around that time, the early 70s, the London Convention was introduced, which prevented the dumping of material, including plastics, at sea. But it wasn't until the late 90s, early 2000s that plastics gained more of the public and scientific attention, and we have the definition of microplastics back in about the year 2000. And since then, scientists have been studying the entrapment of plastics in the oceanic gyres, the accumulation of plastics, the accumulation by plastics of organic chemicals like PCBs, PAHs. Since then, there's been attention paid to the accumulation of metals by plastics, and also washing machine fibers as a source of microplastics. And perhaps most recently, scientists have started looking more at leaching of additives and their impacts on human health and the environment. And over on the right-hand side here, we see this is one of the early publications from the 1970s, where plastic granules or plastic production pellets, which will go into the injection molding machine, were discovered. And here's a more recent article about washing machine fibres. And I have a colleague, incidentally, in our science building who has several washing machines. He's always up there washing items to determine what happens to material as it's being washed and disposed of. Marine plastic then. Who is responsible? Where does it come from? Well, we're all responsible to a certain extent in that we generate litter, and some of us inadvertently may leave litter, others may deliberately leave litter. But the main source really of plastic globally is land-based discharges, and we have sewage effluent, industrial waste, and riverine sources. And in many countries, in Africa, for example, and Asia, there is very limited cleanup of raw sewage or industrial waste, and you tend to get a lot of plastic just coming down into the oceans from rivers. So they are really big sources of plastics. Another source which is more important perhaps in the UK, perhaps in the United States, I don't know, old landfill sites. Before landfill sites regulations came into place and the technology was there before they were lined, a lot of the land was used, coastal land, which was quite cheap, to just dump waste, including plastics. And of course, as the cliffs erode and the shoreline retreats, we end up having landfill sites collapsing with the cliffs, and a lot of plastic is introduced by that mechanism. And finally, marine-based emissions. There are regulations to try and limit marine-based emissions, certainly from ships, but we find that one of the biggest culprits is fishing gear, really. And there is an awful lot of fishing gear in the oceans of various sizes, from down to sort of micrometers up to tens of meters. And this is disposed of maybe inadvertently, maybe deliberately, or maybe it's damaged during a trawl. And over on the right, a famous incident happened here 20 years ago. There was a spillage from a container ship called the Tokyo Express, and that was carrying large containers of Lego. I'm not sure where they were destined for. I think it may have been in the States. And one of the transporters was lost overboard, and we're still finding these curious Lego pieces washing up. And it's interesting, it gives us a chance to date, or to try and look at plastic and how it's weathered over that time, because we know exactly when it was spilled and we can compare it to new Lego. But that is a famous case over here of a marine-based emission of plastic. Probably all familiar, we're all familiar from the media, certainly, of some of the dangers of plastic. They may have subtle effects, no discernible effects, but normally the images and the stories you hear are of lethal or sublethal effects, usually from ingestion and entanglement. So plastic can entangle organisms, especially if it's fishing gear, which is designed to capture animals, fish, and ingestion. And ingestion can occur inadvertently, just passively, or it can occur deliberately. Perhaps animals are looking out for a certain colour or a certain type of material, and they mistake food, plastic for food, and ingest it that way. And of course, it can lead to suffocation and starvation. Sublethal effects include injury to the gastrointestinal tract, malnutrition, because if your stomach is full but of poor nutritional value material like plastic, then you're not getting the nutrients associated with that. You end up malnourished. Plastics can cause disease, they can reduce growth, and something that's been investigated over the past decade is their ability to transfer contaminants. So that's transfer contaminants through the oceans and then ultimately transfer them into the food chain through their ingestion. So on to plastics and contaminants. If you were to submerge anything, including plastic, into seawater, you would end up, the material will be fouled on its surface. it would start immediately, but over the period of months, years, you would start to see accumulations. And over on the right-hand side, this is a bit of polystyrene, which we believe has been at sea for at least a decade. And you can see it's discoloured. This is iron oxide and manganese oxide, which is precipitated on the surface. And if we have oxides like this fouled on plastics, they can act as a rather hydrophilic surface to attract metals. So a number of years ago, people assumed that plastics wouldn't attract metals from their environment because their plastics are quite hydrophobic. But once they start acquiring this charge and this fouling, they can accumulate metals from their environment, and they do so in a similar way to sediment. And what we find is, if we look down here, that things like cadmium and lead, they end up on plastic like this to the same sort of concentration as they do on sediment. So enrichment factors, these are relative to baseline sediment, are close to 1. So there's similar sort of behavior of plastics and sediment in that respect. What we've looked at is these pre-production granules or pellets. These are very common around southwest England, and we use a 10% aqua regia digest, and we find that we get something maybe about 70 micrograms per gram of iron coating the thing, and then small quantities of cadmium and lead, which, as I mentioned, are similar to the values you get in neighbouring sediment. And you can imagine your plastic conceptually. Let's say this is a granule as the core or the plastic matrix, and then it becomes coated in a film, not necessarily this thick, but of iron oxides, organic matter, and other material that's been precipitated, and that acts as a reactive zone, rather like your sediment. Okay, these are incidentally some of these granules that we find, and these are pre-production pellets used for the manufacture of goods. So that this is the raw material for plastics, which is transported and obviously spilt and easy to contaminate. And you see here that many of them are white, but they do, on aging, due to photooxidation, they sort of turn a pale yellow and ultimately sort of dark brown colour. Secondly, what about plastic additives? As I say, something over the past 40, 50 years that the industry have been engaged in. And we have all sorts of additives for plastics. The latest one that I was aware of is an anti-counterfeiting one. I don't know whether you're aware that our new notes, denominations, £5 note, £10 note, are now made of plastic. And one of the reasons is that they can add what's called an anti-counterfeiting additive to make them more difficult to fake or forge than the old paper versions. Of course, we have additives to prevent microbial growth, antioxidants, anti-static agents, impact modifiers, fillers. But perhaps the ones of most concern from a health and environmental point of view are these four here. So we have flame retardants added to heat-generating plastics like this laptop to prevent the spread or the initiation of any fire. Heat stabilizers, especially for plastics outdoors, to prevent them from decomposing, especially important for PVC. Pigments for color, and many plastics have a variety of colors, and we need chemicals to add in particulate form to make them or create certain colors. And finally, plasticizers to make material like PVC more plastic, more flexible. So all sorts of different plastic additives, but these are perhaps the four of most concern. As well as additives, we do end up with other chemicals in plastics. Catalytic residues, for example. If we take PET, something like your standard water bottle, or polyester in your clothing, which is combined with nylon quite commonly, antimony is used as a catalyst, and you end up with quite significant levels of antimony in these types of plastic. And it's a concern that antimony can leach out of microwavable meals, plastic bottles, into the water itself. And there's a concern whether you're, by wearing polyester clothes, whether you're exposed to some sort of dermal uptake of antimony, largely unknown. We've all heard of BPA, bisphenol A, as well as a reactant residue rather than the catalyst. And we do get impurities from the manufacturing of plastic, but also the recycling. Once we start recycling old plastic, as I'll mention later, we end up contaminating contemporary plastics. What about the regulations for these? We have what's called the Restriction of Hazardous Substances Directive in Europe, and this concerns hazardous additives in plastics, and there are 6 that are of concern at the moment, or which are regulated. That's cadmium and lead, chromium-6 and mercury. These are heavy metals. Brominated flame retardants, and it's been suggested that plasticizers should be added to this list, although it's not regulated at the moment. And these are in electronic plastic. So at the moment, these chemicals are regulated to a certain concentration in plastic, new electronic plastic that we as consumers are purchasing. In the US, you have, I think it's a similar standard, it's called the IEEE, which applies to laptops and computers, which is based on the RoHS directive. Then we have limitations in plastics on metals in consumer goods, in packaging and packaging waste, and also in toys. Notice antimony is there, and also in fake or plastic jewellery. So this is where these hazardous additives are regulated. And clearly these are designed to protect the consumer, and in some cases small children, from being exposed to these particular types of chemicals, which are known to be harmful. Regarding cadmium and lead, their limits are 100 or 1,000 microgram per gram, or parts per million. Cadmium is 10 times lower than lead. It's believed that cadmium is, in some quarters, that cadmium is 10 times more harmful than lead, so that's why it has a low level. Brominated flame retardants, certain brominated flame retardants like this one over here, polybrominated diphenyl ether, limited to 1,000 parts per million, or micrograms per gram. So that just gives you an indication of the levels that we're talking about in new consumer products. A little bit more about the RoHS directive. Those chemicals that are limited in every single individual piece of equipment. So if we take a laptop, the amount of cadmium is limited to 100 ppm in the casing, the keyboard, the motherboard, microchips, circuitry, battery, wiring, anything, screen. All these components are limited to 100. So it's not 100 parts per million for the whole thing averaged out. It's for every single individual piece. So this has kept the industry on its toes in terms of manufacturing electronic goods. Note that antimony is not included. Now, antimony, as well as being a catalyst, is also what's called a synergist. Now, flame retardants, brominated flame retardants, can be increased in their efficiency by adding antimony. Antimony interacts with the bromine and forms or reduces the radicals in flame formation. A little bit of an unknown. Antimony is in the same group of the periodic table as arsenic and shares some of its characteristics, but less is known about it. But it's quite surprising that antimony is included in some directives, but not the RoHS directive, because it's nearly always present with flame retardants, brominated ones. Okay, so what about plastics and contaminants in the oceans? Well, we've talked about absorption from seawater, or the metals, for example, or any other organic contaminants that can stick onto the surface of the plastic, and we can look at this with an acid leach. But from what we've talked about on the previous slides, it's clear that many plastics have additives in them, in the matrix. And the only way of really establishing what's in here is to use some technology that can probe non-destructively into the internal matrix of the polymer. And for that, we normally use an X-ray probe, like X-ray fluorescence. Just to briefly outline the principles, portable X-ray fluorescence is ideal for this in this respect, and it has been used by various industries where there are regulations on plastic composition. Simple to use, you can detect elements down to microgram per gram levels in a matter of seconds, and we've tried it on microplastics. You can get down to about 400 micrometers in size before you lose your precision and accuracy. Very simple technique. An X-ray beam is fired at the sample, and secondary X-rays are given off which are characteristic of different elements. So from the spectrum we can work out what's there, and with certain software we can work out convert these to concentrations. The only problem with this technique is it does have some interferences, matrix interferences in some plastics, and it can't discriminate between species or oxidation states. So chromium-3 is perfectly safe. Chromium-6 is very harmful. So X-ray fluorescence will tell you there's chromium there, but it won't tell you which one. So that's in the ROHS directives is chromium-6, which is most important. And it also can't tell you the type of brominated flame retardants. It can tell you there's bromine there, but it won't tell you what type of bromine. And that's a limitation of an assumption, and we sometimes have to consider or assume the worst case scenario. Next slide, a few images of the sort of things that we can measure or we have measured. And we've measured primary and secondary plastics that you find beached. So primary plastics are things like bottle tops, cigarette lighters, balls, toys, straws. Secondary plastics are things that are a little bit more difficult to determine the source. So we might have a piece of rope, might have a fragment here or a film or something that looks like some strapping. So those are the sort of things typically that we can retrieve and measure. Those pre-production pellets, quite easy to measure what's in these plastics. These are about 4 or 5 millimeters in diameter. And foamed plastics like polyurethane, polystyrene. And also, recently we've come across these things called biobeads. These are about the same size as these pre-production pellets, but you'll notice that they're less smooth and rather irregular in shape, and they tend to be usually black. And it turns out that these are used by the water treatment industry. They've kept very quiet about it, but treating domestic sewage and industrial waters, the industry now uses as a tertiary phase plastics, low density plastics with a high surface area that allows growth on them to remove some of the nitrogen compounds in sewage treatment. So you can imagine these will quite easily spill over. You have spillages and you end up contaminating beaches and the oceans with these things as well. Now, if we examine some of our measurements, if we take, let's say, 500 samples from a beach near here, with a limit of detection of, let's say, 10-20 microgram per gram, we find that 35% of these plastics contain bromine, 23% contain cadmium, 31% contain lead. And have a look at the LODs here. These are above sort of 5-10 microgram per gram. And when we were talking about these chemicals that were adsorbed on the surface, we were looking at values that were sort of nanogram per gram, thousands of times lower than this. These are the values that we find on average, several hundred microgram per gram, and we see the maximum values, 43,000 for bromine, 5,000 cadmium, 116,000 for lead. So just to give you a sense of scale, this is about 12% of the entire mass of this plastic sample was made of lead. So you can imagine it's quite dense, but it's also quite alarming perhaps that there is this much of a very harmful compound in beached material. The other thing that's interesting is that when we look at the colours, we find that black stands out. In other words, the most frequent colour which we find these chemicals in beached plastic is black, and the highest levels, certainly of bromine and lead, are nearly always black. Cadmium in this case was red. And over on the right hand side, over on this image here, these are pictures, images of some of the samples which exceed the ROHS. In other words, they exceed the legal limits for cadmium, lead, bromine in electronic plastic. Now, clearly these aren't electronic plastics, but nevertheless they are non-compliant with respect to legislation which is, well, I suppose it's the nearest legislation you could find to this sort of material. So strictly, these here are known as hazardous plastics, and interestingly, strictly, you wouldn't be able to dispose of these in a normal trash. You would have to take them to a hazardous waste trash to get rid of them, as we do with our electronic equipment. So it's food for thought, really, that a lot of the plastics that's washing up in the ocean is actually hazardous, and it should be disposed of in a proper way. And of course, the other thing we notice is that the levels of these chemicals in the plastic itself, rather than adsorbed on the surface in that thin iron oxide layer, for example, are thousands, maybe millions of times higher. And this is what got us thinking a few years ago. Is you know, we have these huge quantities of harmful additives in these plastics, and the question is, where are they coming from, and what sort of impacts do they have? Well, if we talk about the origin, one thing that we notice is that the signature of these plastics, especially the black ones, is of electronic waste. In fact, if we were to plot the bromine against the antimony in these beach plastics, we find that the gradient of the relationship is about 1 to 3, or 3 to 1 if you're talking about bromine to antimony. And this is almost exactly the ratio in which bromine and antimony are found in electronic goods. So laptops, mobile phones, TVs, especially the older types of plastics. And we find here, and in the previous example, nearly 10% of our beach plastic exceeds those ROHS regulations on electronic waste. So we have a high frequency of bromine in these plastics, hence flame retardants, although we haven't been able to determine which type of flame retardants they are. And they are also co-associated with cadmium and lead. So we tend to get a lot of bromine, quite a lot of antimony, but we also find cadmium and lead there. So where does the cadmium and lead come from then? Well, clearly the bromine is from brominated flame retardants. The antimony is this synergist, the ratio 2.5 or 3 to 1. But we find that in electronic waste, if it's reprocessed and recycled, you end up contaminating it with lead and cadmium, because the lead and cadmium is, if you like, in the cullet, it's in the recyclate. So cathode ray tubes, solder joints, stabilizers all contain lead. Cadmium is found in pigments and semiconductors. And if your sorting of material is imperfect, you're not sorting the plastic completely from metal, other components as well, you are bound to contaminate your plastic as well with things like lead and cadmium. So discrete or very notable traits of electronic plastic waste are flame retardants or bromine, antimony, and then heterogeneous concentrations of and occurrences of cadmium and lead. So the question is, where or how do these sort of things end up on the beaches or in consumer goods? This diagram here is a diagram for electrical and electronic equipment. What we do in Europe, and I'm sure in the States you have a similar system here, but when we finish with our phones, our televisions, our electronic equipment, with the waste electrical equipment, what we're meant to do is send it to a special recycling facility, and it's then baled up and shipped across to China, or used to be China. It's more heading towards sort of India, Nigeria now. And here we sort of turn a blind eye, but what happens, or what is supposed to happen, is the material is separated into plastic, metal, and so on. And the plastics are supposed to be divided according to whether they are compliant with the ROHS or not. Specifically, if they have brominated flame retardants, lead, cadmium above those restricted values, they should be incinerated at high temperatures. If they contain these in small quantities or they're not detectable, then they can be recycled, and ideally they should be recycled back into electronic equipment. And then this has this, we should in theory have this closed loop. We're keeping control of these contaminants and eliminating any anomalies here. Another thing, the Basel Convention prohibits the exportation of hazardous waste. Now, the argument is this is hazardous waste because it contains these hazardous chemicals, but there's a caveat, a loophole, that states in the Basel Convention if it's for recycling purposes, it is exempt from this exportation limitation. So if we say we've got hazardous waste, but it's for recycling, then that's different. I know it sounds a bit odd, and it doesn't sound right, but that's the way that this system works. In reality, however, what we find is when we send this electronic equipment away to China or wherever, so we turn a blind eye, but this critical step here, how is plastic separated according to whether it's got flame retardants or lead in it and so forth? Well, if we look at the working conditions in these places, we can quickly see that there is no way that the plastic is separated according to whether it's compliant or not. We have people simply cutting, snipping, dissolving plastic and metal in acid baths, uncontrolled burning, and there's really no way of ensuring that the plastic we export is dealt with correctly, especially the electronic plastic. And what we find, unfortunately, is the wee plastic at this stage, it's not really sorted according to its compliance and whether it has hazardous additives in. And what we tend to find is that a lot of the plastic from electronic waste is recycled back into consumer goods and into industrial plastics, for example, and they end up back being exported to the EU, back to the States, North America, and of course on the way or through consumer goods, a lot of this is lost in nature, and we have this problem of marine pollution, obviously. So these electronic signatures, flame retardants, antimony, lead, cadmium, mercury, rather than being sorted, they are ending up back into society, consumer goods, unwittingly, unknowingly, and this ends up polluting the marine environment. Just another point, the question was, why are we finding these chemicals in black plastics in particular? Well, the reason for this is that it'll be the same in the States as it is in Europe. Black plastic is very difficult to recycle. These are the resin codes that we adopt. So you can see here, 1 is PET, 2 is polyethylene, 3 PVC, and so on. A misconception is that this indicates its recyclability. Well, really, this indicates the type of plastic, so that when a scanner is looking at plastics, it can distribute the plastics into the right bin or the right container. Trouble is with black plastics is infrared radiation, which is used to sort plastic, is absorbed and not emitted by black. So generally, black plastic has to be disposed of, and it's not recycled. And there's been a lot of publicity about this in the UK recently, about why supermarkets, for example, are using black plastic rather than other colours. Of course, if we can't recycle black plastic in this way, the next, if you like, step or next best option supposedly is electronic waste. And it's interesting that if you look at your electronic waste, or your electronic equipment, I'm looking at my laptop, my ThinkPad, my monitor, my mobile phone, they're all made of black plastic, largely black plastic. So black plastic is a convenient source. Sorry, electronic waste is a convenient source of black plastic, certainly for the recyclers. And finally, what about the impacts? We have an occurrence of these hazardous additives in plastics, which end up polluting the marine environment. And we find plastics in organisms ranging from plankton all the way up to whales. So plastic is a ubiquitous, pervasive problem, ranging from nanoplastics of several micrometers in diameter all the way up to things like plastic bags, large bits of fishing gear, large objects. But it's quite incredible, really, how many species have actually been observed to ingest plastics. Certainly for many birds, for example, here we see there are 84 types of this bird here, albatross, I can never say these words, so I'll just leave you to read that one there. And 59% of them, nearly 60%, are known to ingest plastics. Same with gulls as well, and terns. 55 species known, and 40% are known to ingest plastic. So it really is a big problem. And when we look at the diet of some animals, for example, some of the seabirds, their diet is of a significant part of that is fish roe. You can see how the plastic would appeal to them, and it looks just like their diets. These are the biobeads I mentioned from sewage treatment. They look very similar to these fish roes. In fact, they probably look identical when they're submerged. Also, you can imagine that birds being attracted to bright colours. If some of their diet is, for example, orange or bright green, then they would go for that sort of plastic as well, possibly. And we have found through local trawlermen that birds do ingest these plastics to a significant extent. This is a herring gull, which was regurgitated its gut contents on a trawler about a year ago, and we can see here, this is its natural diet. This is crab claws, algae, various other bits here. 50% by weight of its intake was plastic, and of that 50%, or 25% in total, was made up of those biobeads. So some birds seem to be selective in the type of plastic that they seem to be ingesting, perhaps based on its appearance as food. When we analyse these biobeads, of course, many of these are black, and surprise, surprise, they've been recycled from electronic waste. So the water treatment industry is not only using plastic to treat water, it's actually using recycled electronic waste to treat water. And it was estimated for this particular bird that it was exposed to 500 micrograms of bromine as flame retardants, 200 micrograms of antimony, 100 micrograms of lead, 50 micrograms of cadmium, which is well in excess of anything in its diet, by many orders of magnitude. And of course, the question is it available to the bird? Is it accessible? Well, if we think about the plastic, let's say a pellet or a biobead, we have something like lead as an additive inside, and we have lead which is adsorbed on the outside, much lower concentration here. Question is, how easy is it to extract something like lead from this coating, this fouled film, and how easy is it to extract the lead diffusing out of the plastic matrix? So there are two processes, desorption really and diffusion. And we can assess this in two ways. We can simulate the digestive conditions in two representative types of organism. We can mimic, if you like, an invertebrate by exposing this sample to enzymes and surfactants for about 6 hours. So 6 hours is the passage time in the guts of a typical sediment-feeding invertebrate, and its gut is made up of enzymes and surfactants. Or we could expose this to a weak acid in a sort of saline solution for 150 hours, or possibly more. Some birds, they take in plastic and it stays in their digestive system for days, possibly even months, some studies suggest. So it's a much longer term experiment here. Oops. And another thing that we've recently discovered, having contact with some colleagues in Japan, is that in a bird digestive system, once they ingest plastic, they are likely to ingest fish as well, and other parts of their diet which contain oil. And if the plastic is present in the presence of oil as well as acid, that oil is likely to act as a facilitator to mobilize more contaminants from the matrix, because the oil is likely to act as a solvent and sort of denude the plastic itself. And here's some results hot off the press. These were generated a few weeks ago, actually. What we have here is we subjected 10 plastics to an avian, if you like, digestion, acid in seawater, and also what's called a dietary adapted PBET. So this is the digestive system, sodium chloride, this is it with acid, and this is it with acid and the fish oil. And you can see that with the fish oil, we get significantly more of these additives coming out compared with the acid. This is cadmium here, this is lead here. Take a look at the lead, for example. We have 22,000 or 23,000 micrograms per gram of lead in that sample. This is plastic 10 here. And we see that after 150 hours or so, about 2,000 microgram per gram, or almost 10% of the entire amount of lead in this comes out when it's exposed to acid and some sort of fish oil, which is a simulated part of the animal's diet. This is plastic 1. You see total cadmium here was 766 microgram per gram, and we get about 8 or 9. So we get about 1% here out of this plastic here, which has been recycled from electronic waste. No surprise, because it's a black object. We find that invertebrates, perhaps unsurprisingly, that they mobilize less additives and less chemicals adsorbed to plastics than seabirds or their digestive systems, because it's less harsh, it's near neutral, and it's made up of surfactants and enzymes. But nevertheless, if you consider the density of some of these organisms, this is Arenicola marina, this is the lugworm, we get up to 40 of these per square meter on the intertidal zone. And they can process up to half a litre of sediment per metre on a tidal cycle, or a 6-hour period. And you can imagine if there's microplastic in here, you know, there's a propensity for this, or the additives, to be released slowly, but perhaps significantly, because of the sheer scale in which this sediment is overturned, and it's passing through the digestive system of these animals. And we do find, colleagues in Korea have found animals living on styrofoam can accumulate additives. This is mussel, so slightly different type of invertebrate, but it just shows you that any animal exposed to microplastics can accumulate hazardous additives. And finally, diagram not, I sort of deliberately put this here, when we talk about electronic waste electrical equipment, we think of something like this, a television perhaps, but really the electronic waste is ubiquitous, and we find that a significant fraction of the waste or the plastic we find in the oceans is ultimately derived from waste electrical equipment or plastic. It's because of the recycling of that material. And the bioaccessibility of chemicals can reach anything up to 40%, especially for flame retardants exposed to a bird digestive fluid with fish oil. Solutions, what can we do? Well, we could, for example, lobby for loopholes in regulations to be shut. The Basel Convention is a typical example. Why are we allowing hazardous waste, if it's recycled, to be sent abroad? Why are we not dealing with it ourselves? We should also develop regulations in recycled products. So we have these ROHS regulations for electronic waste, electronic plastic, but why don't we have the same legislation for recycled goods? So we could have a recycled consumer good, a toy, something we drink out of, which has been made from an old laptop, which is not subject to the same regulations as the electronic equipment itself. Industry should be doing more to expand the lifetimes of goods. Why are we recycling so much waste electrical equipment, or why do we generate so much in the first place? And perhaps we should have a greater awareness of how we properly dispose of WEEE, because a lot of members of the public are not certain or don't have the ability perhaps to recycle this material if it involves recycling at a specific or specialized facility. So with that, yes, I think that's the end of the presentation. So I hope I've kept to good time, and any questions I'm hopefully able to answer.
Yes, thank you. Very interesting. We will
Is it
take
okay?
questions.
Was it clear enough?
Yeah, I thought so.
Okay, good.
So we'll take questions now. I'll remind our online audience that you can type in your questions through the GoToWebinar toolbar, and I'll read them to Andrew, and then we'll start off with questions here in our room.
With regards to the bioaccessibility of lead experiments, Andrew, what was the material that you used for the plastic matrix?
The plastic matrices were variable, so let's just go back up to the image. So this one here, I think this one was PVC.
Okay.
But we have polypropylene, polyethylene, polystyrene. This one is variable things.
Oh, so you looked at different types of plastic, not only.
Yeah,
okay.
different types of. I don't know what you can make out. It looks like some bit of piping. That looks like a shotgun cartridge, as does that one. That's a child's toy. That's some beads, decorative beads. So yeah, we try and vary the types of plastic, but the PVC does seem to be the one that causes the problems. I think it's the type of plastic and the way the lead is added to it that is the big issue here.
Got it. Thank you.
I think our online audience is still collecting their thoughts. I was interested in, what do you think the reason is that wastewater treatment plants are using the beads? I mean, I know you said nitrification, yeah, but there are other methods.
There are other methods, yeah. I think, if I'm being cynical, I think it's the cost. I think that plastic is cheap, and I think black plastic, when it's recycled from electronic plastic, is extremely cheap and available. I'm not saying the water industries know that it's got these things in it. It's recycled electronic waste, but I'm sure that the factor is that they get this stuff cheap. So there's no reason to use black plastic, let's say, to clean water. But if it's a cheaper source from electronic waste, then that's what they will use. But it does seem to be the trend. I mean, more and more industries seem to be using this plastic as the final stage of the sewage treatment, which I was unaware of until about 2 or 3 years ago.
Okay, we do have one question from online. Is any group that you know of currently working on closing the loopholes for regulations on recycled materials, either in UK or US or elsewhere?
No, I mean, aside from the Basel Convention, no. I think people have been bringing this to the attention of regulators and authorities, but as far as I know, nothing is actively being done, which is a shame. But I think it's the whole issue of plastics in itself. I mean, it made us think about it when we were told we couldn't export anymore to China, and I would have hoped that would have precipitated some discussion and debate about how to use and reuse plastic and recycle it. But instead, it just seems that we've exported it to the next willing country, which may be Malaysia or India, as I say. But yeah, I think it needs more serious thought and lobbying. But at the moment, there aren't, to be honest, there aren't a great deal of scientists working in this particular area. Only a handful that I know of.
A second question from online. In your studies, did you find one or more other kinds of plastic have more of these bromium, cadmium, and lead other than black WE plastics?
Yeah, the black ones tend to be the worst, but some of the very colourful ones have more cadmium in. For example, this one, if you can see this one, this is a toy. Toys used to have an awful lot of cadmium in to make the colour stand out, a really bright colour. So yellows and reds often have cadmium, sometimes lead in as a pigment. And then the black ones tend to have an array of things. So I think if I were ranking them, if you could rank plastics according to colour in terms of their hazard, I would say black ones are the worst, and then yellow, certainly old yellow and red ones would be next on the order. But yeah, cadmium can be used as a pigment to make things look bright, nice and colourful.
Third question. Is there another option for BFR plastics besides incineration? What are the consequences to recycle BFR plastics for making, for example, plastic wood?
Yeah, the danger of, if we go back to the, let's go back to the, can you see the screen? Is it still on?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so if we go back here, plastic containing brominated flame retardants should be incinerated at a high temperature. In something like a cement kiln, it shouldn't really be incinerated in a normal incinerator, and certainly not by open burning, because if you burn uncontrollably brominated flame retardants, they will create dioxins, which are even worse, and that is something which is, it's interesting that many incinerators have regulations on dioxins, but not brominated ones. But that seems to be the only option for getting rid of these brominated flame retardants, is to heat them at a very high temperature to bypass the dioxins. I forget what the temperature here is. It's about 1200, I think. Otherwise, there's been arguments that you could recycle these things into, let's say, plastics which have minimal human contact. So something like guttering or road signs, something like that. But certainly, you shouldn't be recycling them into toys or thermos flasks or cocktail stirrers and things like this that are giving us cause for concern. I'm not sure whether that answered the question or not. I may have gone off at the tangent there.
We don't have any additional questions online or in the room. Oh, one just came in. Let's see. Would you say that if black WEEE is removed from samples you studied, then the level of bromium, lead, cadmium, mercury detected will be way down? Yeah,
I think it's normally, well, it's almost always the black that's colored. It's quite remarkable, really, that I mean, as I say, you have cadmium in some of the yellow and red things, but if you took out the black plastic, then the problem would be, you know, I suppose it would be down by about 90%. And it's almost now as if we can go into the field and we can see plastics and we see certain black things, and we know that it just has that feel about it that it's being recycled from electronic waste. But certainly, yeah, the black is the problem, and if we got rid of the black, then that would get rid of a lot of the issue. So there could be an argument, well, why don't we just try and focus on black plastic when we're doing our beach cleans, or try and dispose of it? But of course, according to this, how do we dispose of it? If we take brominated flame retardants in these, let's see, these things here, let's say these things here, we shouldn't really send them to normal waste, because if they're incinerated by our council, they wouldn't incinerate them at the highest, an optimum temperature, and they would form dioxins. And it's interesting that a couple of colleagues have done beach cleans, not just of black plastic, but all sorts of plastic, and the council refused to take the waste because they say it doesn't belong to the collector. You know, it's not their waste to get rid of, which is rather unfortunate. But yeah, it's an interesting issue, because if we got rid of all this black stuff, we'd get rid of a lot of the problems. But the next question is, well, how do we dispose of it? You know, we're not supposed to landfill it or incinerate it. We're supposed to put it in a cement kiln, but not the sort of thing that we have access to normally.
And last question, I think, before we break. Let me pull it up here. There we go. A little technical difficulty on my side. Is any group that you know of, oops, there we go. Should the black plastic be classified as hazardous waste and incinerated properly?
Yeah, it relates to the previous point. if you have, let's say you have a laptop, and an old laptop which has got lead in the plastic at, I don't know, let's say 2,000 parts per million, then that is hazardous waste. However, if you have a, let's go up to the picture again. Let's say you find something like this on a beach, or it's any consumer product, and it has lead at the same value, 2,000 ppm, then that is not classified as hazardous strictly because it's not electronic. So it seems that when you convert something into an electronic item into a consumer product, you lose that legislation and regulation. So what was illegal suddenly becomes legal because it's something else. And this is one of the points I was hoping, or one of the solutions was why don't we have the same regulations on consumer goods and marine waste as we do on electronic equipment? Because after all, it seems to be derived from the same material, the same source.
Do you have time for one last question?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay. Did you also study leaching potential of these metals in landfills, especially black plastic?
Interesting question. We started looking at some other objects that we've got, glass objects actually, to see the leaching. And it would be an interesting idea to do it to these as well, because I think the landfill, there's a test for landfill leaching based on weak acetic acid over, I don't know, 24 hours or something, which simulates rainfall in a landfill site. So it would be interesting to take things like these items here and see what sort of things leach out in landfill. And of course, as these things age and they get weathered and battered, you're exposing a bigger surface area to the environment. So you have it's more likely that the older these things are, that the more they're going to leach out. But yeah, that is something we're thinking about, but we haven't got around to just yet.
Okay, great. We are up on our hour mark for the webinar, so we'll officially close. I will be posting the slides online and the recording. It usually takes about a couple weeks for that to happen. Yeah. Any final thoughts, Andrew?
I think I'll just ask people to be sort of in the state. Normally we deliver this sort of material presentation to colleagues in Europe, but be interested to see how much of it is applicable or understood in the US as well. Whether people appreciate it, and whether you do use a lot of black plastics for food packaging, and where does your electronic waste go, and have you got any procedures to prevent it from coming back? I doubt it, because we're in a global society. I guess you get the same sort of goods as we do from the same sort of sources, but it'd be interesting to have a perspective on it, or some investigation in North America as to whether it differs or whether it's the same there as well.
Yes, the three of us in the conference room are nodding that there are a lot of black plastics everywhere, and they're used for food. Yeah.
And the other thing is, if you're on a beach, Atlantic beach, Pacific beach, have a look out for those bio beads as well. See if they're buried in the sand somewhere, if you're doing a bit of beach combing.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you.